Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Illinois. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1906, the small township of Hollow Creek, situated in the southeastern corner of McDonough County, Illinois, became the reluctant keeper of a story that many residents would later claim never happened at all. It began, as many such accounts do, with a death. On October 17th, Eleanor Blackwood, a 73-year-old widow who had lived alone in a two-story farmhouse at the edge of Spoon River for nearly 30 years, was found deceased in her parlor by Thomas Whitley, who delivered groceries to the elderly residents of the area every Tuesday and Friday. According to the statement recorded in the county ledger, Whitley arrived at approximately 4 in the afternoon, knocked several times, and when no answer came, tested the door and found it unlocked. This was unusual, as Eleanor was known to be vigilant about security despite the remote location of her property. The grocery man entered, calling her name, and discovered her seated upright in her favorite chair by the stone fireplace, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes open but vacant. The county physician later determined she had died of natural causes, likely heart failure, sometime the previous evening. What made this otherwise unremarkable passing notable was what happened in the days that followed. Eleanor Blackwood had no children of her own, and as far as anyone knew, no living relatives. Yet 3 days after her death, a young woman arrived in Hollow Creek by train from Chicago, presenting herself at the office of Harold Mercer, the town's sole attorney, with a letter bearing Eleanor's signature and the claim that she was the deceased woman's grandniece, Clara Blackwood. The letter, dated August 23, 1906, invited Clara to come to Hollow Creek when the time was right to claim her inheritance. According to Mercer's records, Eleanor had indeed revised her will in late August, naming Clara as her sole heir and beneficiary. The timing struck some as peculiar, particularly since no one in Hollow Creek had ever heard Eleanor mention any family, let alone a grandniece from Chicago. Clara Blackwood was described by those who encountered her as a striking young woman of perhaps 25 years, with unusually pale skin, dark hair worn in a severe style, and eyes of such a deep brown they appeared almost black in certain light. She spoke little, answered questions with the briefest possible responses, and seemed disinclined to elaborate on her relationship with the deceased. She wasn't what you'd expect from a city girl, Martha Holloway, the proprietress of the town's only boarding house, told a local newspaper reporter in 1908. No fancy clothes or airs, just this plain black dress and a single carpet bag. Didn't talk about herself at all. Just asked about her aunt's house and when she could move in. Within a week of Eleanor's burial in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, Clara Blackwood had taken possession of the farmhouse and its contents. The property sat on 15 acres of land, much of it wooded with Spoon River curving around its western edge. The house itself, built in 1870 by Eleanor's late husband, was solid but showing its age, with peeling paint and a sagging porch that locals claimed creaked even when no one was walking on it. What happened next is where the documented facts begin to blend with hearsay rumor and the kind of rural folklore that takes root in isolated communities. Clara kept largely to herself, venturing into town only occasionally for supplies. She declined all invitations to church services or social gatherings. Several residents reported offering to help her settle in, only to be politely but firmly turned away at the property line. By December of 1906, the first unusual reports began to circulate. Hunters tracking deer through the woods near the Blackwood property claimed to have seen lights moving among the trees late at night, described variously as like lanterns being carried by unseen hands, or ghostly blue flames hovering just above the ground. While easily dismissed as hunters' tales embellished over whiskey at the local tavern, these stories persisted and multiplied. Martin Crawford, whose farm adjoined the Blackwood property to the north, told the county sheriff in January of 1907 that he had been awakened several nights in a row by a woman's voice, not singing exactly, but chanting something in words I couldn't make out. Crawford, a widower of 65 years and a deacon in the Methodist Church, was considered by most to be a reliable witness, not given to exaggeration. When the sheriff rode out to investigate, he found nothing amiss, but noted in his report that Clara Blackwood appeared agitated by his questions and eager to see me off her property. The winter of 1906 to 1907 was particularly harsh in that part of Illinois. Heavy snowfall isolated many farms for weeks at a time, and by February, concern for the welfare of those living alone had prompted the formation of a committee to check on elderly and solitary residents. When two men from this committee approached the Blackwood house on February 12th, they reported finding the lane uncleared of snow, yet a thin trail of footprints leading from the house toward the river. They followed these tracks for several hundred yards before losing them near a stand of bare sycamore trees. Upon returning to the house, they knocked repeatedly but received no answer, though smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was in residence. Looking through the windows, they could see that the interior appeared orderly, with a small fire burning in the parlor grate. Concerned, but without legal authority to enter, they reported back to the town that Clara Blackwood seemed to be managing the winter, but was perhaps even more reclusive than previously believed. As spring approached, strange stories about the Blackwood property continued to circulate. Children walking home from the schoolhouse, half a mile down the main road, claimed they could hear a woman crying from the direction of the old house. A traveling salesman who had unknowingly approached the property seeking directions reported being struck by a feeling of such overwhelming dread that he turned his horse around and rode 5 miles in the opposite direction before the sensation subsided. Most troubling were the reports from farmers whose lands bordered the Blackwood property. They spoke of livestock behaving erratically, horses refusing to approach certain parts of shared fence lines, cows failing to produce milk, chickens ceasing to lay eggs. Martin Crawford lost 3 calves that spring to an unidentified illness that the local veterinarian could only describe as a wasting sickness I've not seen before. In April of 1907, Reverend Thomas Pike of the Methodist Church decided to pay a pastoral call on Clara Blackwood. According to the detailed account he later provided to the County Historical Society, he arrived at approximately 2 in the afternoon of April 18th. The day was unseasonably warm, and he noted that while most farmhouses in the area had windows open to catch the spring breeze, the Blackwood house remained tightly shuttered. After several minutes of knocking, Clara opened the door just wide enough to acknowledge his presence. The Reverend described her as gaunt, as though she had been ill, with dark circles beneath eyes that seemed unusually alert, almost feverish. When he offered spiritual comfort and an invitation to Easter services, she declined both, stating that she followed different traditions. What struck Reverend Pike most forcefully, however, was the smell emanating from the house. Not the expected odors of cooking or living, but something vegetal and earthy, like turned soil mixed with herbs I couldn't name. Before closing the door, Clara asked the Reverend a question that he later confessed had troubled him deeply. "Do you believe, sir, that what we inherit goes beyond material possessions? That some legacies are written in our blood and bones?" When he attempted to engage her on this philosophical point, she abruptly ended the conversation and shut the door. It was around this time that residents of Hollow Creek began referring to Clara Blackwood as the witch, initially behind closed doors, eventually more openly. No specific accusations of witchcraft or maleficence were made. Rather, the term seemed to emerge as a way to categorize a woman who defied the social expectations of the community. That Eleanor Blackwood had occasionally been referred to by the same epithet during her later years was a connection not lost on the older residents of the town. In the local newspaper's archives, a brief article dated May 3, 1907, noted that the reclusive niece of the late Eleanor Blackwood had been observed collecting plants and soil samples from various locations around Hollow Creek, including the cemetery where her aunt was buried. The article, clearly disapproving in tone, questioned what purpose these collections might serve, and reminded readers that disturbing grave sites, even for scientific purposes, is both legally and morally prohibited. Whether Clara was indeed removing material from graves was never established. However, the suggestion alone was enough to further alienate her from the community. By early summer, local merchants reported that she had ceased coming into town altogether. Supplies were delivered to the edge of her property by Thomas Whitley, the same grocery man who had discovered Eleanor's body. Whitley, known for his discretion, revealed little about these transactions except to say that Clara always left payment in a tin box at the head of the lane and collected her goods only after he had departed. The summer of 1907 brought unusual weather to McDonough County. According to meteorological records, rainfall was significantly above average in June and July, with Spoon River rising to levels not seen in decades. Yet residents living near the Blackwood property insisted that a strange, localized drought seemed to affect the land immediately surrounding the old house. Witnesses described a rough circle, perhaps a quarter-mile in diameter, where vegetation withered and the soil cracked, while lands just beyond this perimeter remained lush and green. Martin Crawford, the neighboring farmer who had reported hearing chanting months earlier, told the county sheriff in August that he had observed Clara Blackwood walking along the riverbank night after night, always around midnight, carrying what looked like a small clay pot. When asked if he had approached her or called out, Crawford admitted that he had not. There was something in her manner, he was quoted as saying, something that warned against interference. On September 14, 1907, almost a full year after Clara's arrival in Hollow Creek, a significant incident occurred that was documented in both the sheriff's records and the local newspaper. Shortly after dusk, a fire was observed on the Blackwood property. Several nearby farmers, spotting the flames, formed an impromptu bucket brigade and rushed to the scene, fearing the house itself might be ablaze. What they found instead was a large bonfire in the clearing behind the house, with Clara Blackwood standing before it, apparently unaware of or unconcerned by their arrival. According to multiple witnesses, scattered around the fire were strange objects, variously described as small bundles wrapped in cloth, clay figures, and what looked like animal bones. Most disturbing to the witnesses was Clara herself, who was allegedly covered in a substance that in the firelight appeared to be blood. When approached by the men, Clara reportedly showed no alarm or embarrassment. She thanked them for their concern, but assured them the fire was intentional and under control. When asked about the blood, she replied simply that she had been preparing a special meal and invited them to leave her property. The men, uncomfortable and uncertain of their legal standing, withdrew but reported the incident to Sheriff William Tanner the following morning. Tanner rode out to the Blackwood property on September 15th, but found no evidence of the previous night's fire beyond a circle of scorched earth. Clara received him calmly, explaining that she had been burning refuse and that the substance witnesses had taken for blood was merely berry juice from preserves she was making. With no clear evidence of any crime and no complaint beyond general unease, the sheriff had no grounds to pursue the matter further. However, in his official report, Tanner noted that during his conversation with Clara, he observed several unusual features of the house's interior visible through the open door, walls covered with what appeared to be hand-drawn symbols, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling beams, and a large book open on a table, written in what he described as no language I have encountered in my 58 years. The sheriff concluded his report with a personal observation. While I find no cause for official action, I must record my professional opinion that there is something deeply amiss with Miss Blackwood and her household. I have encountered all manner of individuals in my years of service, from the merely eccentric to the genuinely dangerous, and while I cannot articulate precisely why, I place Miss Blackwood in the latter category. As autumn returned to Hollow Creek, the stories surrounding Clara Blackwood grew increasingly unsettling. Children claimed to see her standing motionless at the edge of the schoolyard, watching them during recess, though she would be gone when teachers looked. An elderly woman living on the outskirts of town insisted that Clara had appeared at her bedside in the middle of the night, just standing there, saying nothing, though her doors and windows had been locked. Martin Crawford, whose health had been declining since summer, died suddenly on October 1st, 1907. The county physician attributed the death to heart failure, but Crawford's daughter, who had come from Springfield to settle his affairs, told several neighbors that her father's last coherent words had been a warning to beware the Blackwood woman, and a claim that she had taken something from him that couldn't be seen or touched. It was against this backdrop of growing fear and suspicion that the events of October 17, 1907, exactly 1 year after Eleanor Blackwood's death, took place. What actually occurred that night has never been fully established, as accounts vary widely and official records are sparse. What follows is a composite of the most consistent elements from various testimonies collected in the weeks and months that followed. Shortly after sunset on October 17th, multiple residents of Hollow Creek reported hearing an unearthly sound coming from the direction of the Blackwood property. Descriptions ranged from a woman screaming to a sound like the wind howling, but there was no wind that night, to a kind of singing that made the hair stand up on your arms. Whatever the sound was, it was loud enough to be heard in the town center, more than a mile away from the isolated farmhouse. Sheriff Tanner, along with 5 male volunteers, set out for the Blackwood property. By the time they arrived, full darkness had fallen. From the head of the lane, they could see that, unlike its usual shuttered state, the house blazed with light from every window. The men proceeded cautiously up the drive, calling out as they approached. There was no response to their calls, but the front door of the house stood open, golden light spilling out into the yard. Sheriff Tanner ordered 2 men to remain outside while he and the other 3 entered. According to his official report, submitted 3 days later, the interior of the house appeared to have been the scene of a significant disturbance. Furniture was overturned. Glass from broken windows and shattered lamps littered the floors. The walls, which he had previously observed to be covered with strange symbols, were now further marked with what appeared to be handprints in some dark substance. In the center of the parlor floor, a large circle had been drawn, containing more of the unfamiliar symbols he had noted during his previous visit. Of Clara Blackwood herself, there was no sign. The men searched the house thoroughly, then expanded their search to the outbuildings and surrounding woods, but found no trace of the missing woman. The only potential clue to her whereabouts was a trail of what looked like footprints leading from the back door toward Spoon River, but these prints stopped abruptly at the water's edge. Over the following days, a more organized search was conducted, including dragging sections of the river, but Clara Blackwood was never found. The house remained empty, its contents largely untouched, despite the evident chaos of that October night. No relatives came forward to claim the property, and after the legally required period had elapsed, it reverted to county ownership. In the years that followed, various attempts were made to sell the Blackwood property, but no sale was ever completed. Prospective buyers invariably withdrew their offers after viewing the house, often without explanation. In 1910, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the structure, leaving only the stone foundation and chimney standing amid the overgrown fields. The land remained vacant, a place avoided by locals and unknown to outsiders. Those few who ventured onto the property reported a persistent feeling of being watched and an unnatural silence. No bird song, no insect noise, only the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass that gradually reclaimed what had once been Eleanor Blackwood's carefully tended garden. In the spring of 1912, almost 5 years after Clara Blackwood's disappearance, the County Historical Society received a curious donation, a small leather-bound journal, its pages water-damaged and many entries illegible, purportedly found in a sealed tin box uncovered during the construction of a new bridge over Spoon River, approximately half a mile downstream from the former Blackwood property. The journal, attributed to Clara based on several dated entries that matched her known residence in Hollow Creek, offered tantalizing but fragmentary insights into the young woman's thoughts and activities. The Historical Society's archivist, Meredith Holcomb, transcribed what legible passages remained, noting with scholarly caution that the document provides more questions than answers and may indeed be a carefully constructed fraud rather than an authentic record. One of the earliest decipherable entries, dated December 2, 1906, read, "Aunt Eleanor's preparations were more extensive than I had anticipated. The house itself seems to breathe with purpose. I find evidence of her work in every corner, though cleverly disguised from casual observation. The locals view me with suspicion already, as she warned they would. It matters little. I have not come for their approval, but to continue what she began." A later entry from February 1907 contained a passage that would later be cited by those who believed in Clara's malevolent nature. "The winter deepens, and so does my understanding of what flows beneath this land. Aunt Eleanor's maps prove accurate. I have located 3 of the 7 points she identified and confirmed their properties. The convergence is more powerful than I expected, almost overwhelming when approached at the correct hour. What she managed to contain for so many years now strains against its boundaries. What points Clara referred to or what convergence she monitored was never clarified in the legible portions of the text. References to her great-aunt Eleanor suggested a shared project or pursuit spanning decades, though its exact nature remained obscure. Several entries mentioned the inheritance, but always in terms suggesting something beyond mere property or possessions. A particularly troubling entry dated April 20, 1907 stated, "Crawford grows too curious. I find evidence of his trespassing nearly every day. Footprints by the north cellar window, displaced stones in the garden wall. Yesterday he stood at the property line for nearly an hour, just watching the house. I cannot allow such intrusions, not at this critical stage. The boundaries must be reinforced." This entry, discovered only after the journal's donation to the Historical Society, cast new light on Martin Crawford's declining health and eventual death, which some now viewed as potentially connected to whatever reinforcement Clara had implemented. However, with both parties deceased and no medical evidence beyond the official determination of heart failure, such connections remain speculative. The most substantial and disturbing entry, dated September 13, 1907, the day before the reported bonfire incident, read, "The final preparations are complete. The vessel is ready, purified according to Aunt Eleanor's specifications. Tomorrow night, when the moon reaches the precise position, I will open the way as she instructed. Her calculations indicate a window of opportunity that will not recur for another 87 years. I cannot fail. What began with her grandmother must reach fruition with me. The circle must be completed." The last decipherable entry, dated October 16, 1907, the day before Clara's disappearance, consisted of just 2 sentences. "Something is wrong. It knows." The discovery of this journal might have been dismissed as an elaborate hoax, perhaps perpetrated by someone seeking to extend the legend of the Blackwood Witch, except for what happened to Meredith Holcomb, the archivist who transcribed it. According to colleagues at the Historical Society, after spending several days working with the journal, Holcomb began to complain of disturbing dreams in which she witnessed scenes from Clara's life in vivid, inexplicable detail. She could describe the interior of the Blackwood house with extraordinary precision, said William Porter, the Society's director, in an oral history recorded in 1915. Rooms she had never seen, furniture arrangements, the patterns of wallpaper, details that were later verified by comparing them to Sheriff Tanner's original reports and the recollections of those few who had been inside the house. Holcomb also reportedly began to suffer from a mysterious ailment that physicians could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. She described feeling as though something essential was being slowly drained away, accompanied by episodes of extreme fatigue, memory lapses, and occasional periods of disorientation. Despite medical attention, her condition deteriorated steadily over the course of several months. On August 18, 1912, Meredith Holcomb left her home in Hollow Creek, telling her husband she was going for a walk to clear her head. She never returned. A search was organized, but no trace of her was ever found, except for a single shoe discovered on the banks of Spoon River, on what had once been the Blackwood property. The parallel between Holcomb's disappearance and that of Clara Blackwood 5 years earlier was not lost on the residents of Hollow Creek. The journal that had apparently connected the two women was sealed in a metal box and locked in the Historical Society's storage vault, where it reportedly remained untouched for many years. In the autumn of 1912, another unusual development occurred. A woman named Sarah Tanner, the 20-year-old daughter of the now retired Sheriff William Tanner, began to exhibit behaviors that her father found disturbingly familiar. According to accounts from neighbors and family friends, the previously sociable and conventional young woman became withdrawn and secretive. She took to wandering alone near Spoon River, collecting plants and soil samples in a manner reminiscent of Clara Blackwood's activities. Most alarming to her father was Sarah's sudden interest in the Blackwood case. She reportedly asked him detailed questions about his investigations, requested access to his personal records from that period, and expressed a desire to visit the now vacant property. When he refused this last request, citing concerns for her safety, she allegedly replied, "It doesn't matter." According to the Reverend's private correspondence preserved in the church archives, Tanner believed his daughter was under some manner of influence connected to the Blackwood woman and feared she might follow the same dark path to whatever end befell Miss Blackwood. Acting on these concerns, Tanner arranged for his daughter to stay with relatives in Iowa, hoping distance from Hollow Creek would sever whatever connection he perceived between Sarah and the troubling events of 5 years earlier. "I can see it clearly enough in my mind." Former Sheriff Tanner, deeply troubled by these developments, confided in Reverend Pike, who by then had served the Methodist Church in Hollow Creek for over a decade. According to family letters, Sarah's unusual behaviors gradually subsided during her time away, and when she returned to Illinois in the spring of 1913, she appeared to have returned to her former self, with no apparent memory of or interest in the Blackwood matter. The former sheriff, however, remained unconvinced that the danger had truly passed. In a letter to Reverend Pike, dated July 7, 1913, he wrote, "While I am grateful for my daughter's apparent recovery, I cannot shake the conviction that whatever force operated through the Blackwood women, both the elder and younger, continues to seek new vessels through which to work its influence. I fear it is not confined to bloodlines, but may transfer its attention to any who become entangled in its affairs." This theory of transference gained credence among those familiar with the case when, in September of 1913, Thomas Whitley, the grocery delivery man who had found Eleanor Blackwood's body and later delivered supplies to Clara, was discovered wandering in the woods near the old Blackwood property in a state of extreme disorientation. According to the physician who examined him, Whitley was experiencing a profound dissociation from reality, believing himself to be Eleanor Blackwood and insisting that he needed to prepare the house for Clara's arrival. Whitley was eventually transferred to the state hospital in Jacksonville, where doctors diagnosed him with acute melancholia with delusional features. He remained institutionalized until his death in 1915, never fully recovering his grip on reality or providing any coherent explanation for his presence on the abandoned Blackwood land. When found by a hunting party, Whitley was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, having apparently been outdoors for at least 2 days. More troubling than his physical condition was his mental state. As the years passed, direct connections to the Blackwood case became fewer. Those who had personal interactions with either Eleanor or Clara aged and died. The foundation of the burned house gradually crumbled and became overgrown with vegetation. County records regarding the property were filed away and largely forgotten, yet the story persisted in the oral tradition of Hollow Creek and surrounding communities. Parents warned children against venturing too close to the witch's land. Local folklore evolved to incorporate elements of the Blackwood saga, often embellished or altered in the retelling. The bare facts, a reclusive older woman, her mysterious heir from Chicago, strange activities, and an unexplained disappearance, provided fertile ground for elaboration. In 1915, a significant discovery added another layer to the already complex narrative. During renovation of the county courthouse, workers uncovered a previously sealed compartment within a wall containing records dating back to the 1860s. Among these documents was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1867 concerning the trial of Constance Blackwood, described as an elderly woman of unsound mind on charges of unnatural practices and suspicion of causing harm through arcane means. Essentially, a witch trial conducted more than 2 centuries after such proceedings had largely disappeared from American jurisprudence. According to the article, Constance, who would have been Eleanor Blackwood's grandmother, was ultimately acquitted due to insufficient evidence, but the judge ordered her to leave the county. Historical records confirmed that by 1870, when Robert and Eleanor Blackwood built their house along Spoon River, Constance was deceased, having reportedly died in Chicago in 1868. What made this discovery particularly intriguing was a statement attributed to Constance during her trial. When asked about the nature of her unnatural practices, she allegedly responded, "I am merely the caretaker of something far older than myself, as my mother was before me and her mother before her. It does not belong to us, rather, we belong to it. The inheritance passes from woman to woman in our line, not by choice, but by necessity." This statement, with its reference to an inheritance passing through female generations, eerily echoed the fragmentary journal entries attributed to Clara Blackwood nearly 40 years later. It suggested a continuity of purpose spanning multiple generations of Blackwood women, though the exact nature of this inherited obligation or burden remained undefined. Further investigation into the courthouse records revealed another relevant document, a brief report from the county sheriff in 1867 describing a visit to Constance Blackwood's home prior to her arrest. The report mentioned strange markings upon the walls, numerous dried plants and animal parts preserved in jars, and a large book written in no language known to me, details strikingly similar to Sheriff Tanner's observations in the Clara Blackwood house 4 decades later. These parallels led some to speculate that the inheritance mentioned by both Constance and Clara might have included specific knowledge, practices, or even physical items passed from one generation to the next. The large book noted by both sheriffs in particular became a focus of speculation, a grimoire or manual of some kind perhaps, containing instructions for whatever ritual or purpose the Blackwood women pursued across generations. In the spring of 1916, the final documented incident connected to the Blackwood case occurred. A geology student from the State University, conducting a survey along Spoon River, reported finding an unusual stone formation on what had once been the Blackwood property. The formation, which he described as clearly artificial but of indeterminate age, consisted of 7 stones of varying sizes, arranged in a pattern that he found mathematically significant, but not conforming to any known cultural tradition. When the student attempted to document the formation through photographs and measurements, he experienced what he described as a sudden and overwhelming sense of being observed by multiple presences. This sensation was accompanied by physical symptoms including nausea, disorientation, and temporary blindness. He fled the area, abandoning his equipment, which was never recovered. The university subsequently dispatched a small team to investigate the site, but upon arrival, they found no trace of the stone formation described by the student. The team leader noted in his report that the area specified appears to have been recently disturbed, with evidence of soil being moved and vegetation uprooted, suggesting the intentional removal or concealment of whatever structure previously existed there. The geology student, troubled by his experience, reportedly suffered from nightmares and periods of unexplained anxiety for months afterward. The precision of the stone's placement, their relationship to astronomical alignments, and their position relative to the river's flow all suggest a purposeful arrangement meant to channel or direct energies in specific ways. He further noted that his calculations indicated the center of the formation corresponded precisely to what would have been the parlor of the original Blackwood house, the same room where both Eleanor Blackwood had died and where Clara had drawn the circle of strange symbols observed by Sheriff Tanner on the night of her disappearance. In his academic journal, he wrote, "I cannot escape the conviction that what I encountered was not merely an archaeological curiosity, but something actively maintained and defended, even in the absence of any visible human caretaker." This connection between the stone formation and significant events in the Blackwood narrative suggested a geographical focus for whatever inheritance passed between the women of that family. The geology student theorized that the location itself might hold some special property or significance, with the Blackwood women serving as custodians of the site rather than owners in the conventional sense. This interpretation aligned with Constance Blackwood's court statement that it does not belong to us, rather we belong to it, implying a reversal of the normal relationship between people and property. It also offered a potential explanation for why the inheritance seemed to sometimes reach beyond bloodlines to affect others who became involved with the property or its history. Individuals like Meredith Holcomb, Sarah Tanner, and Thomas Whitley. As 1916 drew to a close, the land that had once belonged to the Blackwood family remained vacant, neither sold nor developed. Local authorities, perhaps influenced by the accumulation of troubling incidents associated with the property, designated the area as unsuitable for habitation due to periodic flooding and unstable ground conditions, technical reasons that conveniently justified leaving it undisturbed. Spoon River continued to flow along its western edge, as it had for centuries before the Blackwoods arrived and would for centuries after their departure. The people of Hollow Creek went about their lives, the story of the witch's inheritance gradually fading from immediate concern to local legend, its details blurring with each retelling. Yet even as the 20th century progressed, bringing world wars, economic upheavals, and social transformations that dramatically changed life in rural Illinois, certain constants remained. Locals still avoided the overgrown acres where the Blackwood house had stood. Parents still warned children against venturing too close to that bend in the river. And occasionally, usually in autumn, when the light slanted just so through the trees, residents living nearby would report seeing a solitary female figure walking along the riverbank at dusk, always headed toward the water, never returning from it. Whether this figure represented Eleanor, Clara, Meredith, or some other woman drawn into the orbit of whatever power resided there, no one could say with certainty. Perhaps it was merely a trick of light and shadow, combined with the power of suggestion and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Or perhaps, as the geology student had theorized, there was something in that place that required human attention, human caretaking, human sacrifice, generation after generation, an inheritance whispered in the dark, passing from woman to woman across time. The most comprehensive academic examination of the Blackwood case was conducted in 1914 by Dr. Elias Thornton, a professor of folklore studies at the university in Champaign. Thornton, who had heard rumors of the Hollow Creek witch during his childhood in a neighboring county, approached the subject with scholarly rigor rather than sensationalism, spending several months collecting testimonies, examining available records, and contextualizing the events within broader patterns of rural American folk belief. His resulting monograph, titled Feminine Mysticism and Community Response in Rural Illinois, devoted a substantial chapter to the Blackwood women and the reactions they provoked in Hollow Creek. While careful to avoid definitive conclusions about the supernatural elements of the case, Thornton offered several observations that shed light on the social and psychological dynamics at play. The isolated female practitioner of esoteric arts represents a persistent figure in the American rural landscape, he wrote. Such women typically exhibit three characteristics that place them outside normative social boundaries: economic independence, rejection of conventional feminine roles, and possession of knowledge deemed inappropriate or dangerous, particularly knowledge related to natural processes of fertility, birth, and death. According to Thornton's analysis, both Eleanor and Clara Blackwood fit this archetypal pattern perfectly. Both women lived alone, managed their own affairs without male oversight, and displayed knowledge of plants, minerals, and natural cycles that exceeded what was considered appropriate for respectable women of the era. Eleanor's 3 decades of solitary residence after her husband's death had already marked her as unusual in a society that expected widows to either remarry or join the households of adult children. Clara's arrival as an unmarried woman from the city, apparently intent on maintaining the same isolation, only reinforced the community's perception of the Blackwoods as existing outside normal social boundaries. What distinguished the Blackwood case from many similar instances of rural witch accusations, Thornton noted, was the apparent continuity across generations. Most such accusations focused on individuals with any familial connection to esoteric practices, carefully hidden or denied by relatives wishing to avoid similar stigma. The Blackwoods, by contrast, seemed to embrace their inheritance openly, with Clara deliberately stepping into Eleanor's role and apparently continuing whatever practices had earned her great-aunt her reputation. This suggests not merely individual deviance from social norms, Thornton wrote, but a tradition consciously maintained and transmitted, a system of knowledge and practice preserved despite community disapproval. He further observed that such lineage-based transmission of esoteric knowledge was more commonly documented in European contexts than American ones, suggesting the possibility that the Blackwoods were maintaining Old World traditions in the New World setting. Among Thornton's most valuable contributions was his identification of a possible origin for the Blackwood family's practices. Through careful examination of immigration records and church registries, he traced the family line back to a small village in Northumberland, England, noting that the area had been known for folk practices blending pre-Christian beliefs with elements of formal Christianity, practices often focused on boundaries, thresholds, and liminal spaces such as riversides and forest edges. In such traditions, Thornton explained, certain locations are believed to serve as points of contact between the ordinary world and other realms of existence. These points require tending and maintenance, usually by individuals specifically chosen or born to the task. The responsibilities of such caretakers might include maintaining physical markers, performing periodic rituals tied to celestial cycles, and serving as intermediaries between the community and whatever forces are believed to reside beyond the boundary. This framework offered a compelling interpretation of the Blackwood women's activities. The isolated property along Spoon River might have been selected precisely because of its proximity to what was perceived as a significant boundary or threshold. Thornton was careful to present this interpretation as one possibility among many, noting that The actual beliefs and intentions of the Blackwood women remain largely speculative, known only through the often hostile perceptions of their neighbors and the fragmentary writings attributed to Clara. Nevertheless, his analysis provided a coherent framework for understanding the various elements of the case. The isolation, the nocturnal activities along the riverbank, the gathering of materials from specific locations, and the apparent ritual performed on the anniversary of Eleanor's death. The inheritance passed from Eleanor to Clara would then have consisted not merely of physical property, but of the obligation to maintain this boundary and the knowledge required to do so. What Thornton could not explain, and did not attempt to, were the reported effects on individuals who became involved with the Blackwoods or their property after their disappearances. The experiences of Meredith Holcomb, Sarah Tanner, Thomas Whitley, and the geology student fell outside the scope of traditional folklore studies and into realms that academic discourse of the early 20th century was ill-equipped to address. Thornton concluded his analysis with a prescient observation. Whether one interprets the Blackwood case as an instance of rural superstition, psychological contagion, or genuine metaphysical phenomenon, its persistence in local memory suggests a deep resonance with fundamental human concerns about boundaries between nature and culture, known and unknown, living and dead. Such narratives endure not because they document historical events with perfect accuracy, but because they encode anxieties and beliefs too profound for direct expression. The physical evidence related to the Blackwood case remained scattered and inconclusive. The journal attributed to Clara after its brief examination by Meredith Holcomb was reportedly sealed in the Historical Society's archives. However, when a researcher attempted to locate it in 1916, the metal box in which it had been stored was found to contain only ashes, as though the journal had spontaneously combusted without damaging its container. The courthouse records regarding Constance Blackwood's trial were catalogued and preserved, but they offered little insight into the specific nature of her unnatural practices, beyond vague accusations from neighbors about strange lights, unusual sounds, and livestock ailments similar to those later attributed to Clara's presence. The stone formation discovered and then lost by the geology student was never officially documented. His field notes, containing sketches and measurements, were stored in the university archives but attracted little scholarly attention at the time. The student himself, after completing his degree, reportedly abandoned geology entirely and became a Methodist missionary in South America, as far from Spoon River as he could manage. Physical traces of the Blackwood house gradually disappeared as nature reclaimed the site. By 1915, only the stone foundation remained visible above the encroaching vegetation. By 1916, even that had become difficult to distinguish from the surrounding landscape, unless one knew precisely where to look. Yet, even as tangible evidence faded, oral traditions persisted. Residents of McDonough County continued to share stories of the Blackwood women, often embellishing or altering details with each retelling. In some versions, Eleanor and Clara were portrayed as victims of community prejudice, their knowledge of plants and natural remedies misconstrued as malevolent magic by ignorant neighbors. In others, they were genuinely sinister figures, deliberately working to harm the community through arcane means. Perhaps most significant was how the story was integrated into the community's understanding of place. The bend in Spoon River, where the Blackwood property had stood, became known locally as Witch's Curve, a designation that persisted long after the original events had faded from living memory. Even those who scoffed at the supernatural elements of the tale might casually observe that fish caught near that bend never tasted quite right, or that the ice there broke earlier in spring than elsewhere along the river. The land itself remained undeveloped, passing into county ownership for non-payment of taxes, and then being designated as unsuitable for construction due to periodic flooding, a convenient administrative solution to the problem of a property no one wished to own. Proposals to incorporate it into public parkland were consistently rejected, often with vague references to maintenance costs or accessibility issues, rather than any acknowledgement of the land's troubled history. One final document, discovered among Reverend Pike's personal papers after his death in 1916, provides a fitting conclusion to this account. In a letter apparently written but never sent to Dr. Thornton, the Reverend offered his own interpretation of the Blackwood case, informed by both his pastoral role in the community and his direct encounters with both Eleanor and Clara. "I have come to believe," he wrote, "that what we witnessed in Hollow Creek was neither simple superstition nor straightforward malevolence, but something more complex and perhaps more ancient than our modern minds are equipped to comprehend. The Blackwood women served something they perceived as necessary, even vital, though its nature remains obscure to those outside their tradition." He continued, "What troubles me most as I reflect on these events in my advancing years is not the question of whether their practices were real in the sense of producing tangible effects. The evidence for such effects, while compelling, remains anecdotal and subject to multiple interpretations. Rather, I am haunted by the possibility that they were attempting, in their isolated and perhaps misguided way, to maintain a boundary or balance that did indeed require maintenance." Pike concluded with a reflection on the nature of inheritance itself. We think of inheritance primarily in terms of material possessions or genetic traits, forgetting that our most profound inheritances are often duties, obligations, and understandings passed from one generation to the next. The Blackwood inheritance appears to have been of this nature, a responsibility neither sought nor easily relinquished, tied to a specific place and perhaps a specific time. In their absence, he added, one wonders who, if anyone, has assumed that responsibility or what consequences might follow if such an inheritance, whatever its true nature, were to remain unclaimed. As the 20th century progressed beyond the scope of our narrative, the Blackwood story gradually transformed from recent local scandal to established regional folklore. The specific details of Eleanor's death, Clara's arrival, and the subsequent disappearances became less important than the archetypal elements they embodied: the isolated female practitioner of esoteric arts, the inheritance passed through generations, the boundary between known and unknown, represented by the river. Variations of the tale spread to neighboring counties, adapting to local landscapes and concerns. In some versions, the Blackwood women were protectors, maintaining a barrier that kept something dangerous at bay. In others, they were themselves the danger, seeking to open a way for forces better left undisturbed. The truth, if it can be said to exist independently of these interpretations, remains as elusive as Clara Blackwood herself. What can be said with certainty is that the land where the Blackwood house once stood continues to evoke unease in those who know its history. Even in the early decades of the 20th century, when rational explanations were increasingly preferred over supernatural ones, local residents reported experiences there that defied easy categorization. Sudden temperature drops on warm days, sounds with no discernible source, the persistent feeling of being observed. Perhaps most telling is that despite the passage of time and the general development of the surrounding area, that particular bend in Spoon River remained relatively untouched. No bridges spanned the river there, no roads approached too closely. The property lines drawn on county maps created a buffer around it, as though by tacit agreement the community had decided that whatever resided there, memory, superstition, or something less easily named, was best given its space. In the end, the story of the witch's inheritance of Hollow Creek is not merely about Eleanor and Clara Blackwood, or even about the community that feared and ultimately mythologized them. It is about the relationship between people and place, about the boundaries we perceive between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and about the power of narrative to shape our understanding of experiences that elude conventional explanation. The inheritance whispered in the dark continues to pass from teller to listener, from generation to generation, not through bloodlines, but through the human tendency to seek meaning in mystery and to find resonance in tales of boundaries crossed and prices paid. Whether its ultimate nature is psychological, sociological, or something else entirely remains, perhaps appropriately, a matter of individual interpretation. In the words attributed to Clara Blackwood in her fragmentary journal, some inheritances cannot be rejected, only passed along. The circle remains unbroken, though those who maintain it may change. What flows beneath this land has flowed for centuries before us and will continue long after we are gone. We are merely its momentary caretakers, bound by blood and choice to a duty few would understand and fewer still would willingly accept. As twilight settles over Spoon River on quiet autumn evenings, when the boundary between day and night blurs and the world seems to hold its breath in anticipation of darkness, some still claim to see a solitary female figure walking along the riverbank near what was once the Blackwood property. Whether she is perceived as threatening or tragic, malevolent or misunderstood, depends largely on the observer. What remains consistent in these sightings is the figure's direction of travel, always toward the water, never away from it, and the curious fact that no footprints remain in the soft earth of the riverbank to mark her passage. Like the Blackwood women themselves, she leaves few tangible traces, yet her presence lingers in memory and narrative. An inheritance whispered in the dark, a legacy passed from generation to generation in the quiet corners of Hollow Creek, Illinois.